Standing back to back, the mighty Ranger Minsk dispatches a menacing kobold with a final swing of his sword, while Dynahear the wizard roasts a small group of the vicious little creatures with magic fire. As the last of the kobolds falls, Minsk shouts, "Jahira, I require healing, lest my hamster become an orphan." The druid sighs and places her hands on Minsk, chanting the words to a curative spell. Meanwhile, the clever thief Immelwyn searches the bodies of the recently departed kobolds, finding a few coins and some magic arrows. His wounds healed, Minsk shoulders his hefty blade and strides boldly into further depths of the dark cavern. But he halts as he hears a deep, otherworldly voice utter this command: "You must gather your party before venturing forth." Greetings, everyone, and especially fans of 20-year-old isometric RPGs, and welcome to another episode of Dungeons and Decisions, a Displaced Beast production. On this show, a group of guys with 30-plus years of experience of playing role-playing games together discusses the context of notable choices made while playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, all to help you, the audience, discover the path of maximum fun. Well, we've got a lot to talk about today, but first, let's meet those guys.
All right, so I'm Alan Barris, the forever DM and sometimes dwarf.
I'm Chad Freitag, just kind of more of the min-maxer and always the player.
I'm Mike, I'm the anti-hero and much more handsome than Chad.
I'm over here.
Not my screen, you're down there.
And here we go. So in today's episode, we are going to address the construction of an adventuring party. There are a lot of metaphorical hamsters running around in this particular ranger's pocket, such as historical expectations, perfect party optimization, and the individualism in role-playing. But let's start out with my specialty, framing the issue in very broad strokes. Towards that purpose, here are 4 points to consider as we move to a more nuanced discussion. Point number 1. Teamwork is a large component of D&D. Players must work together to overcome obstacles and to solve problems. In the words of Helen Keller, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." Point number 2. The traditional hazards of D&D adventures require skills and abilities that are unique to particular character classes, leading to the common perception that a complete set of these skills and the abilities must be represented in an adventuring party. It's not necessarily a bad idea, but it can, if it's taken too far, it can lead to what I call perfect party syndrome, which is something that I, unfortunately, am guilty of myself, probably because I've played way too many games of Icewind Dale, created a party, played for like 2 hours, scrapped that party, started over again. Which is, probably something I should see a therapist about. Point number 3. The D&D character, however, is a creative expression of the player and should fulfill to the highest extent possible that individual players' role-playing expectations and or needs. And that brings us finally to point number 4. An imbalance of this team versus individual issue can create a number of different problems, like a party that can't work together and meet the challenges that a dungeon master provides, or the classic "I got stuck with the cleric" issue, where one player gets pressured into a character they don't want to play for the sake of the team, or a problem that I like to call the Shadowrun dilemma, which is basically when the games become more centered on the individual roles rather than the characters, and basically you have a game that's really like 4 different games with every player kind of taking over for a while. We'll probably talk about Shadowrun more in future episodes, and we have a great Shadowrun story for a lead-in, but today we're going to focus on some other things, and to talk about the history of party composition, how it's played out in every edition of the game so far, including 5th edition. Al is going to take over. So take it away, Al.
All right, so let's talk about the history of party role composition. So it turns out that in the original days of D&D, the various character classes put together would create a balanced party. So your character role, as long as you had 4 people playing and you had everybody playing a different class, you would get a balanced party by default. Now, there's some ways that you could still screw it up, but for the most part, that's how things worked. So just to review our original 4 character rules, we had the fighter, who of course was a specialist in fighting and also in damage absorption. This is what video game players call the tank. This is somebody who will be out in the front rank and take damage and keep the squishier members of the party away from harm. Then there's the thief, who is a specialist in skills, mostly lockpicking, stealth, and trap detection, and also in the occasional dealing of a substantial amount of damage through backstabbing, usually that you would have to benefit from by working with a bigger group. You would have to coordinate with the fighter or maybe sometimes the cleric in order to get that backstabbing bonus. Then the cleric, who specialized in healing and support and utility. And then finally, the magic user, who specialized in big damage and support and utility, depending on the circumstances, but mostly big damage. So this got complicated a little bit with the demi-human classes. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with how original D&D did things, it was assumed that everybody was human. Everybody who was playing one of the main classes was going to be some flavor of human, whereas the demi-humans, the dwarf, the elf, and the halfling, were all their own classes. You could not be a dwarf fighter, you were a dwarf. So the dwarf was mostly a fighter. He had slightly better con saves, and I think that was pretty much it. The elf was a cross between a fighter and a magic user. You couldn't quite fight as well as the fighter, you couldn't quite cast as well as the wizard, but you could do both. That was the origination of what people sometimes refer to as a gish, the idea that it's the fighter and caster. And then finally, the halfling, who was mostly a thief. They had hiding as a skill, and a ranged fighter, but they didn't have the same range of skills that the thief would. So that said, how the demi-humans fit into this pattern was sometimes kind of difficult to figure out, because the dwarf, okay, mostly fighter, but how does the elf fit in, for example? Now this is where we start getting the idea of the 5th man. That is the idea that a party properly balanced might end up with 5 members rather than just 4, and that 5th person could be a demi-human playing the Chewbacca role and going along with the other group of humans. Now that said, in AD&D, otherwise known as First Edition, the racial classes were eliminated. So we got the race and class as independent choices, as anyone who has played later editions of D&D is familiar with. So this complicated that original class structure to a certain extent by adding a few other options like the barbarian, the bard, and the monk, who didn't quite fit into the 4-class pattern all the time. And now a barbarian was a pretty good swap out for a fighter. They pretty much do the same thing. Whereas the bard and the monk were their own kind of special animals. They didn't fit into that structure of that 4-part group. So chances are, again, we were always thinking of a group as either a 5-person group, or it had to be a balancing act in motion. We had to figure out how to actually play that group to its best abilities. Now, 2nd edition changed the way that the original rules worked. They cut everything back down to warrior, wizard, priest, and rogue. So everything had to fit into those categories. So a bard, for example, which was its own class, now became a subset of the rogue. The paladin, which had been its own class, a combination of healer and fighter, was now classed under fighter and or warrior and so forth. And if you didn't fit into this 4-part structure, well, it sucks to be you. Goodbye, monk. You're not going to show up until the complete psychic years after the other books come out. So second edition introduces these, also introduces the idea of custom class characters, which we actually based a whole campaign on, although it never quite got finished and it got derailed by other good campaign ideas. We'll talk more about those guys later. Now, custom class characters were really difficult to slot into the traditional party roles, but the game really didn't intend them to be main character choices. They were just intended to be a little bit of flavor on the side. They also were not intended the way we used them, which was to sort of create a unique character. They were supposed to be designed to create like a explorer class that then multiple other people could belong to or something like that. So third edition returns to the familiar assortment of classes with no main defined roles. So this, we go right back to first edition where the barbarian and the bard and the monk are all individual classes. And they all have slightly different roles. And things got very complicated with the addition of prestige classes. Now, the tricky part of prestige classes was that there was no character class requirement to get into a prestige class. So a sorcerer and a wizard and a cleric could all eventually qualify for the same prestige class, as could some of the other less likely options. They just have to wait till a higher level. So this could get very confusing because you might have started off as a nice, helpful healer, but your healing ability might stall because you decided that you wanted to be a true necromancer instead, and you might have a bunch of undead handling abilities instead that had nothing to do with your original class role. So third edition, you really needed to know your character, and you really needed to know who you were playing with, and you needed to observe how these characters would act and interact with their abilities. So, fourth edition, the hated edition. Now, fourth edition did have some good ideas in it, and I actually hate to admit it because, again, as will be an ongoing theme, I both love and hate fourth edition. I liked a lot of elements of it, but I can't get over my dislike for some elements of it too. And it almost killed D&D for me, actually. I was considering not playing 5th edition as a result.
Could we just call this the ex-girlfriend edition of D&D
yes,
for you, Al?
I cannot get over 4th edition. So let's go back.
I thought I needed therapy for my perfect party syndrome.
So let's go back to the source of my therapy, my bitter ex-girlfriend, 4th edition. So the 4th edition class party was divided into party roles. And these party roles, as many of the critics of 4th edition, I think correctly pointed out, this was an attempt to make D&D play more like a video game, and to give a very quick understanding to players about what role their character was supposed to play. So the party roles roughly correspond to the original classes, but they didn't entirely, which is another source of frustration to a lot of longtime players. So the first role was the striker. Now, this was the damage dealer in the group, and traditionally this was associated with the thief. Now, you'll notice that when we talked about first edition, original D&D, I mentioned the thief's backstabbing ability. Well, that became the core of the thief class, or the thief, or the rogue class in 4th edition. It was the ability to put out a lot of damage with your backstabbing. The ranger, if I remember right, got reclassified as a striker, putting out a lot of damage with ranged weapons and so forth. Then the defender was the damage taker. That's your old steady fighter. That's your tank. Then the controller. Now, the controller was the wizard, and this is why a lot of people hated 4th edition, because the wizard was fundamentally unsatisfying to play. you were a battlefield controller. You denied zones of the battlefield to your enemy, which is not nearly as cool as killing a whole bunch of things with a lightning bolt or a fireball. You still had fireball, but it was kind of lame and kind of nerfed. So it did not work as well, and it denied a lot of those wizard players their desire to roll a big fistful of dice. Then the leader. Now, the leader was associated with the cleric. Also, the bard ended up getting classified under that later on. So the leader was a buffer and a healer. They also introduced a class that unfortunately they cut for 5th edition, which was the warlord, which was a combination of sort of a fighter and cleric character. So a lot of people hated the video game-like nature of this division, but I will point out to you that this made adding a new character class to your group really easy, which was very important because 4th edition added a lot of character classes. For those of you who have been complaining about the lack of what they traditionally called splat books for 5th edition, 4th edition went the other route. They had books for everything. They got up to 3 different players' handbooks, 3 monster manuals. They had guides for everything. They just introduced a lot of new character options, and it was sometimes very hard to keep up with them. So imagine you just have a new guy join your group, and that new player says that he's playing an Avenger. Well, in any other edition of D&D, everyone would just kind of stare at him and wonder, well, what the hell does that do? So in 4th edition, we would say, oh, that's a divine power source version of a striker. So then it would be like, okay, well, run over behind the fighter and kill that thing we're fighting, and be careful because you can't take as much damage as that fighter. Everybody would know basically how your class was supposed to operate in a fight. The other problem with 4th edition is that everything was the fight. That all of the characters were balanced out with the idea that you're going to be equally useful to combat, which is not the case in any of the other editions of D&D. All right, so that said, now 5th edition. So the structure of 4th edition was totally thrown out, and now we're back to something very close to 3rd edition, where we have we eliminated prestige classes, but we added these subclasses and also backgrounds. So the key to party balance is understanding how the classes work, yes, but you also have to understand how the backgrounds and the subclasses work too. So for example, you might have a divine soul sorcerer who is a fairly talented healer instead of a direct damage dealer, and that sorcerer would need to hang on to their spell slots for healing the party. Or you might have a fighter with a criminal background who might be really competent at stealth and lockpicking. All right, so that brings us up to the present, and now I will move us over to Chad.
Yay! All right. Welcome to Chatting with Chad. I'm Chad. Let's chat. Al covered a lot of the stuff that I was going to cover, so we're good. No, I'm going to talk about optimizing our party. As Al mentioned, the beginning of D&D, there were 4 classes. We disregard the dwarf and the elf, and that was the fighter, the thief, the mage, and the cleric. As D&D evolved into later editions, we started seeing more subclasses, more classes, more kits, more prestige things. And this just started kind of blending a lot of the multiple classes that you had together. So now, if you had a fighter that could cast magic, say the Eldritch Knight, he could do some spells in the middle of battle. It wasn't so much, I'm going to hit this thing, I'm going to hit him with a spell and this thing. Or for thieves, again, we talked about how they kind of stayed in the background, maybe shooting their bow from the back row. But now you can be a shadow assassin and kind of jump out of the shadows, be in the middle of the fighting, and pretty much just stand toe-to-toe with the fighters. Instead of having the hit points, they have kind of the armor class or the dodge ability. So now that your characters are representing multiple classes, and they're doing them very well, you see that in 5th, no one's going to be stuck being the cleric because you need a healer. Pretty much any class is going to have some kind of access to healing. Maybe it's an ability, maybe it's a spell. They all have short and long rests so that you can kind of do healing. And then, of course, you can always buy healing potions if you find that your cleric, would rather sacrifice his healing ability to control undead instead. So optimizing is kind of no longer about what specific classes that we need to have, but what roles we need to fulfill. And then also, as Al had mentioned earlier, we're looking at kind of using that video game terminology that kind of came out of RPG games, like tank, the striker, the healer, DPS, which is damage per second, AoE, area of effect spells, utility, crowd, all these things. So what we want to do is move on and kind of get our group that kind of can cover all our bases in roles. So let's narrow it down to about 4 categories. We're going to have the tank, which is kind of somebody he either can take a lot of damage because he's got a lot of hit points, or a very good armor class so he can not take any damage, or something that can kind of engage a lot of the combatants at once so you can kind of act as protection from the people in the back so they don't have to waste a lot of their skill points or abilities in being able to protect themselves. They can focus on their role. Your second one is your healer. That's pretty much your cleric, but it could be a druid, or it could be some kind of other buff spells or just magic abilities. And then you had your damager, DPS. Again, the thief is a great one for his backstabbing. But then you also have some kind of mage classes that when they get high level, they can do one big major spell on one creature, or a big area of effect spell that can take care of a lot of creatures. Something that can kind of maximize their ability while only a fighter can take care of one guy. And then you had your support and utility roles. A lot of these, pretty much any of your characters can do some kind of support utility. Again, I'm going back to mages. You could cast a web spell to kind of disable a lot of characters so you can focus on them one at a time. Or a cleric giving buffs or debuffs that give advantages to the characters fighting or disadvantages to the foes that you're fighting. Outside of combat, they can kind of grease the story along and give it more flavor. So as roles for optimizing our party, for tank, I think I covered some of this. We want to kind of distract the enemy from the rest of the party as long as possible. And I kind of narrow this into the category of don't die. You got 2 categories. Really, the only roles you want to fill is don't die and kill everyone else. Anything that kind of, it's very complicated. It's very Nietzsche. What doesn't kill you gives you experience and makes you a higher level. For the tank, you want to basically engage everybody, take the damage, and then let everyone else kind of kill it. I mean, usually the fighters, tanks, are actually pretty good killers themselves. You also want a lot of damage-dealing abilities that can kill them instantly before they can hurt you, or, like I said, web control or teleport them away or charm them. All these things, don't get hurt, kill them instead. So really you kind of want to look at being able to anticipate different scenarios and have somebody that can kind of fulfill that role or jump into that role as they need to. One thing you can look at also, when you're playing a video game, you can kind of take advantage of some AI scripts that, I can send the biggest guy in there, they'll only fight him, these guys can do whatever the hell they want. You can kind of do this the same with your DM too. I'm looking at you, Al. The DM probably won't cheat for you, but if you decide you want to make 4 squishy first level mages, he's probably not going to try and kill you. He's going to probably try and work with you, tell a story, and unless you really are going to do something like ninja kick the leader while like 20 bows and arrows are pointed at you, he's probably not going to try and kill you.
That was a very viable strategy.
Yeah.
I rolled bad.
Poor life.
Good callback to episode 1.
So one of the ways to optimizing your party is knowing your DM. Does he do a lot of long and short rests, or is each session a marathon slog with no breaks? So if you
Chad, is this gaming the game master? Is that what this section is?
This is going to be optimizing your party. But a lot of it is involving kind of questions and what role do I want to play and how is that going to fulfill in a normal campaign? And you really can't know that unless you know your DM. And a lot of this is kind of evolution in progress as you play, which I'll go into later, but I think is one of the great strengths of 5th edition is you can change or morph into whatever role you want as the game goes on. And I think we all do that, and we slowly change our characters back and forth. But some of the things of knowing your DM is, like I said, is it going to be a lot of short or long rests? If you're a mage, do you want to use up all your spells right away with like an Avon calling fireball into a group of enemies, or do you want to wait till you're at your last legs and you're about to die? This could be your Hail Mary. Does the DM ambush you? Does he do a lot of traps? Are there going to be monsters behind every door? So these are kind of the roles that you want to kind of think ahead of time of how can I solve this problem? And one of the things of a balanced party is kind of knowing what your weaknesses are too. Are you all melee characters? So what are you going to do if all of a sudden you got flying creatures that are attacking you? How do we defend against that? If we don't have a thief, do we have spells or abilities that can open locked doors? Maybe it's just a high strength check or a cleric spell or a mage spell. So I think the key is to anticipate these things before the DM springs it on you. And let's set. So really, I think optimizing the party is more about anticipating some of the roles that you have to play. I think with 5th edition, you can pretty much be any class you want. So if you want to be a cleric class, it's because you want to play the cleric. The cleric who doesn't heal is fine. Over to you.
All right, not to be outdone by Chad. This is Mike for Mike's Musings or Mike's Amazing Musings. So let's muse. Playing a character that does not fall into a stereotypical role can be quite amusing and fun. Now, let me caveat this. This is a more advanced technique. You want to have talked about this with your DM and make sure that your fellow players are on board with it. You can have a lot of fun, but you can also have a lot of failure. As long as everyone is willing to go along with the potential failure, again, with crisis comes opportunity. It also creates a lot of great role-playing opportunities. To put it another way, Picasso was originally a classical painter before he was an impressionist. So I put it in other words, you need to know the rules before you can break the rules. So it's really more of an advanced technique. It's probably not something you want to do for a beginning party or as a beginning player, but once you have a experienced DM and or experienced group of players, it can work out quite well. So I think, as I was thinking about it, I came up with 3 ways of doing this, although there's probably a lot of other alternatives. But the first one is basically based on your character build. So for example, if anybody's read the classic Robert E. Howard Conan novels, as compared to the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, where he's more or less a big, beefy, fighter type. In the novels, he's actually much more of a rogue type, but he happens to be a barbarian. So he's big and strong, but a lot of stealth, a lot of sneaking. And so that's where you would utilize, for example, taking that, you would rely on the racial bonuses and advantages of a barbarian, in terms of your strength and constitution. But if you were to utilize high dexterity and the requisite skills, instead of taking like a large bladed weapon, great axe or something like that, if you concentrated on 2-weapon fighting, on small arms like daggers, maybe even other more arcane stuff like darts. So you can play against type there. From a role-playing standpoint, you can also play off of those stereotypes. One character of mine was a dwarf character who aspired to be an elf, and so had a lot of racial animus towards other dwarves, and really idolized and really took all the types of traditional things that you would associate with an elf. So that's kind of the second category, where it wasn't as much the character build as the way I played the character that brought a lot of role-playing opportunities to the fore. The third category, I think, is more about place. We had a campaign setting called Ravenloft that we played, which is a, you think you're Dracula, or Frankenstein, Gothic horror type environment. Very grim, very dark. Death is right around the corner. The build that I had for that character was a resident, a sort of a fallen noble type, who was the Count von Count, who, if anybody remembers that from Sesame Street, was the name of the Count there. I drew a little inspiration from the naming. And since this was such a grim, dark environment, I decided to take another approach and to play a cleric who didn't heal. So that cleric was patron deity, was one that didn't provide any healing spell. It was more of a damage dealer. And again, so my role-playing aspect there was really riffing off of the environment that we were in, as opposed to other considerations. So those are three, examples for you on ways that you can try and play a character that goes against type for fun and frivolity. And with that, I will turn it back to Mark for some group discussion.
Yeah, so obviously we want to, take a little time to process all of this. But, whether you're a traditionalist or an optimizer or a wacky individualist, there is always an adventuring party waiting for you to join it, right? There's room for everybody at the table. We support you in all your play styles. I think that, we mentioned some various issues, or at least I did at the beginning of this, trying to kind of figure out how to balance all of this. And since Dungeons and Dragons really is, after all, a relationship, it's probably a cliche to say this, but the key to any relationship is communication, right? So that involves communication between players and communication with your dungeon master. If your dungeon master enjoys kind of more action and combat, then the player should know that from the beginning, so they make sure they have the appropriate characters. Whether your dungeon master is more interested in a kind of more diplomacy campaign with more social interaction and role playing, likewise the characters should be informed so they can build in that direction. Occasionally, we don't.
I was going to say, that sounds much better than taking advantage of your DM.
Well, I may not have a catchy, chat with Chad,
Right. Corner, don't forget.
I'm thinking about the issues. But we can see, obvious problems if this sort of thing doesn't happen, right? The stuck with, especially with, inter-player communication, the stuck with the cleric thing is obviously a breakdown between players where they're not kind of acknowledging everyone's right to play the character that they want to play and not working as a team, or a breakdown in communication between the dungeon master and the players where they're basically playing two different games. I actually experienced this problem myself. I was starting a superhero campaign using the role-playing rules. I had prepared this adventure that I was super excited about, that was going to be, this classic, like, super team brawl between heroes and villains out in the streets. It's like the Avengers and the Masters of Evil. I was stoked and ready to go, and I get there, and everyone who's playing rolls up these characters that are all these like wacko troubled loners with like these oddball powers. None of them particularly well oriented to a slugfest in the streets. And so basically I came there ready to run like Silver Age Marvel, and they were all ready to play Vertigo. So it was a disaster, an absolute and total disaster, and it could have all been fixed if I, just told them beforehand, but this is what I'm going to do. So think about that when you're making your characters, or vice versa. If I'd let them make their characters first, then I could have like run some kind of wacky Invisibles campaign, and they would have been super happy. So communication is key. You know, do a session 0, communicate, talk about these things at the beginning so that you don't have problems down the line. And Chad's point was also very good in that even if you don't do this, there are plenty of mechanisms in 5e where you can fix things down the line. You know, you can take feats, you know, like the skilled feat where you can pick up like a number of skills and basically make yourself the rogue in terms of skills if you want to, or the party communicator or whatever if you forgot to do that. And or you can, you know, you get to 2nd or 3rd level, you can take the appropriate subclass that'll make you more versatile. If you're the bard, you know, you can do the College of Valor to make yourself a tougher fighter. If, you know, the party needs a little beefing up, you know, Al mentioned the Divine Soul Sorcerer, which, you know, you can use to kind of swap in for a healer. So there are ways to kind of fix things if you don't get it all right the first time when you're starting. But once again, you just...
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, it's just going to reiterate, you just got to be open and communicate about it.
I was just going to dovetail on that. Don't be afraid to fail. I mean, as long as you've got a good party, you know, sometimes you won't always get it right the first time. You know, worst case scenario, you can always re-roll another character. But you're spending your hard-earned time on this to amuse yourself and your friends. And so if you've got an idea and you think it's fun, and it's like, you know, I don't care if I do a lot of damage, I'm just going to be, you know, rolling, you know, down the aisle and amusing myself for hours on end, then, you know, go for it. You know, the Count not only didn't heal people, I think he probably almost contributed to some people's death on occasion. So,
to be fair, my character died of his own poor decision making, so that's it. That's the only defense I will utter of the Count.
But again, that only worked because the party was good with it. If people had not been down with you know, a backstabbing, metaphorically, cleric, the Count would have fallen on his face. So but again, you know, it's sometimes a little trial and error. But you know, and even monks can't walk up walls sometimes. You know.
Not until they're high enough level. Communication. The best story, I think, was with communication. If we had known we were going to have a cleric that didn't heal, you know, we could have maybe bought some healing stuff. We were over at Mark's house, and we were playing, and his wife was joining in, and both Al and I, automatically knowing that Mike had a cleric, were buying a bunch of healing potions. Sarah's like, well, why are you buying healing potions? We have a cleric. And we're like, oh. So, again, if you play with each other long enough, you almost don't have to communicate some of these things. But yeah, communication is definitely key. And I think 5th edition was very balanced, like we talked about before. I think the only thing you really can't do is have everyone be the same role. Again, like Mark's story with the superheroes. If everyone's filling the same role, you've got a lot of gaps, and no one can kind of be a star with their specialty because everyone's going to kind of compete to be that spokesperson or the crazy guy or, you know, all that stuff.
Though, I mean, we should say a couple of words. We did actually have a imbalanced campaign. We did the Fighter Thief campaign.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that more, I think, in later episodes. But I think, like, even in that case, right? If you're doing a game where you're all playing wizards or you're all playing rogues or whatever, like, even then there has to be a little bit of difference between those characters. Everyone's got to have their own thing, right? You can't be, you know, all lining up to backstab someone.
Sure, much. Well, we're all playing them.
So,
all right, Al died to talk, so let's let him talk.
All right, so the other thing it helps to know is your DM's attitude towards death. and what the expectations are going to be for failure in your campaign. D&D has gradually drifted away from its original roots, where it was pretty much the DM versus the players. And your character was probably going to die at some point, probably because you did something stupid, but that was part of the expectations. The idea was it was more of a survival game than anything else. Now, there are still games that do that. Incidentally, the code word for you young players who are looking for that kind of game is old school Renaissance, otherwise known as OSR games. And a lot of them are based on the original pattern for D&D or Gamma World or any number of other games like that. So 5th edition has actually drifted in an opposite direction, where you kind of have to try to die. Or you have to be really overmatched, or you have to be really stupid. There has to be some combination of factors that's going to off your character. For the most part, you're probably going to give up on a character before it gets killed. So, but it again, it depends on your DM. If your DM is aiming for a really high lethality game, there are some rules, actually, that you can put optional rules from the DMG and other optional rules that are floating around out there that can make the game a lot more dangerous. And again, if you're going to be playing in that kind of game, well, just bear in mind that party role is going to be vital. Being able to play with your other characters is going to be really important, or else a bunch of you are going to die. In a regular game, however, I hate killing player characters. I mean, I'll just come out and admit it. I don't like doing it because I spend a lot of time thinking about a campaign and trying to get stories to work with those characters. And when a character gets offed by a kobold in session 3, well, that doesn't do my story any good. Now, I'm not George R.R. Martin. My world does not have random death built into it for the most part. Or if it does, I'm probably going to let that character get resurrected or revived. I mean, and it also turns out the healing magic's a lot easier to get, and the magic to return your character to life is easier to get than it's been in previous editions. So, I mean, you just have to know, again, the style of the game and the sort of the expectations that the DM has going into. Well, and again, a session 0 kind of setup is great for finding that information.
Well, and character death can actually deepen, not a true death, but because didn't in the custom class campaign, wasn't the whole shade thing, wasn't that like a
reaction
sort of
to you getting
death?
offed? I don't remember how we worked that out. It's been a long time. But, I mean, a loss of a character can actually be really dramatic. I mean, some people really like that sort of thing. But I try not to bring it up with active groups. Bear that in mind. There are going to be times in our current D&D group where things are going to get a lot more dramatic near the end of the campaign. And at that point, well, the rules might change. But for right now, you're all pretty safe.
Foreshadowing.
I have no taste. I like all your characters. So, but later on, we'll see.
I don't know if that brings up another topic, but what about a balanced party that 1 or 2 people can't show up for the meeting?
All right, so yeah, that's another huge thing that all DMs have to deal with. So when somebody can't make it to your session, what do you do? Do you let somebody else in the group play them? Because with tools like Fantasy Grounds, it's actually remarkably easy to do that. You can just give control of that player over to, or that character over to another player, and just say, hey, you're playing that character tonight. Now, the problem is, of course, if their beloved character does something stupid that week and gets killed, well, suddenly you are to blame for this, and it looks like you put a hit out on that character. So we try, again, I'd say in a high lethality campaign, you always, especially like an OSR type game, you never want to do that. Right. Unless you've just said right from the beginning, these are all trash characters and I don't care what happens to them. As long as you've accepted that, it's okay.
Well, it's like lending out your car. You right. would only do that to somebody who you trust.
Or if your car is really crappy and you don't care about it. So.
I have mixed feelings about it. You know, if you're right in the middle of something and like it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for that character to suddenly disappear,
Right.
right? They take a nap on the wagon or whatever. It's like you're kind of in the situation where, for continuity's sake, you kind of have to. And in that case, as a DM, I would usually like take over the character, to both like to keep things in continuity and keep it going, but also kind of like as a kind of built-in safeguard to make sure that that character doesn't die. Because hey, I know what's coming up. I'm not going to do something stupid. So, but if that's not necessary, right? If there's a very, very easy way to kind of drop that character from action for a little while, and I say like fill in the blanks as necessary. Give your player characters a magic item that can help them with that role, or even better, like create an awesome NPC who can accompany them and do the things that are necessary.
A helpful lizard man to take all their experience.
Yeah. I love the NPC allies, and I just finished a campaign, and we started the game, and I at the very beginning of the game, and it was the first game was a prison escape scenario kind of thing, where they were trapped in a cell, and they didn't have a rogue.
Yeah.
So I tossed in an NPC rogue to help them, and it turned out to be like one of my favorite NPCs of all time. And yes, he was in fact a lizard man. So that there's ways around it. Once again, you just have to be thinking about it in advance and making sure that you communicate and no one's feelings get hurt. It's kind of odd that we kind of took this turn from like party kind of creation, and then into like character death.
It's just important to know what the consequences of fate.
Kind of weird that's where we went, but that's where we ended up pretty much.
When you look at the abyss looks back.
So on that encouraging note, I can't think of a better place to quit for today. So thanks everybody for listening and or watching. We as always really enjoyed doing this. So on behalf of everyone here at Dungeons and Decisions, I wish you all a good evening or a good day, whatever applies, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.